I'm also going to start recording because I'm going to record this training overall so that our other community partners that aren't able to make it today have an opportunity to review and listen and hear this presentation since some of them aren't able to make it today. And I'm going to try to see if I can pin. Well, to get us all started, because I know our time is valuable, my name is Cindy Abzun. I'm a training outreach coordinator here for Oregon State University, working with the LC team and the Oregon Early Childhood Inclusion team. Today we're gonna be talking about dollars and cents. This is gonna be a different manner in which we present this material. Usually we had information from ECTA that we would share out, but today I felt like it's better if we get it out from other individuals. So I invited West Ed to come and present for us. Uh, so Tia, Meg, Anthony, and Leslie are all from West Ed. But I also want to go ahead and first start with us always remembering and recognizing that we are having this learning experience in our Indigenous communities and Indigenous tribes. We want to make sure that we are all committed and also want to remind you that us as a part of LC are committed to remembering that we are guests here on Indigenous land, that we are committed to learning about the 9 recognized uh, tribal communities that are here in Oregon, and then that we are committed to action. So that we are asked to take action, that we are also involved in that action. If you want to find out more information, there's a QR code on the screen so you can find out about the living document that's available. This is a document that's constantly being updated when we get new information. And then at the bottom, that QR code is if you want to find out which part of an indigenous land you are currently residing, depending on what area you are. And I think it does the entire United States. It's not just Oregon. Here are our core values for today's training and objectives. We are going to compile information and resources that have to do with financing and high quality inclusion, preschool inclusion. We want to construct finance and staffing. We'll be able to compile somewhat of an action plan and start having those discussions when it comes to how to provide embedded and special education or related services. We'll develop somewhat of a formal agreement when it comes to working with school districts, but our state is a little bit different because we worked more with ESDs, which are the Early Systems District Department, something like that. But they're a special education department that works with our children that have an IFSP, an individual family service plan. And we want to also discuss the state agencies, state leadership teams, and the way that we're able to support and embed these special educations and related services in the regular education. I do want to also drop on the chat our, oops, our attendance. That way I can keep track of who is here and submit it for oral credit. phone to everybody. There you go. I hope that works. Yes, it does. Okay, there goes the link for the training attendance for today's training. I am going to hand it off to our presenters.
Yeah, you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted.
Yeah.
All right, Zoom is like all over the place for me. I'm gonna go ahead and share our slides, but I'm gonna turn it over to Leslie to kick us off and then we'll get started. So Leslie, please.
Well, hello, and thank you so much for the invitation to be a part of this convening, the opportunity to learn more about Oregon and your approach to supporting and financing, which is part of supporting inclusive practices in early childhood special education and support services. We'll introduce our team one by one in a moment, I think, but I'll just go ahead and say my name is Leslie Fox. I really appreciate the opportunity to be up here. I have worked at WestEd about 4.5 years, and I am the director of our early childhood intervention, which is birth to 3, Part C, preschool 619 IDEA services. We have early childhood mental health work that we do around consultation and reflective practice and supporting the social and emotional development of infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, their families and caregivers and teachers, and then inclusive practices, specifically around the pyramid model and social and emotional development within the pyramid model structure. But that's my job at WestEd. My fun part is that I was a therapist for children with disabilities in early childhood settings for the better part of 30 years. I had the luxury of working with families in Texas, North Carolina, Virginia, and then I worked on military bases overseas with military families in Italy and Spain. I also worked at the U.S. Department of Education in the Office of Special Education Programs, where I did a lot of the development and oversight of special education systems. So we administer the IDEA grant awards that go to all of the state systems, both Part B and Part C. We provided the technical assistance and support or professional development sometimes, but definitely a lot of technical assistance around use of funds, permissible use of funds, and ensuring that IDEA systems were compliant with federal law. And then I actually oversaw state systemic improvement plans, which are a very specific component of education systems and Part C programs requirements to submit to OSEP as part of their annual performance reports. So I am super excited to be here today and represent early childhood, because that's all I do is early childhood. And I think what can be really interesting about some of this work is that we often forget that early childhood programs and initiatives, none of them, not a single one, was ever intended to be a standalone program or service. They are always intended to be part of a greater comprehensive systems of supports. And so when we're talking later on about different funding streams and different sources of revenue that can be used to address the individualized needs of young children with delays or disabilities, it's really important to realize that we think beyond our school systems, because early childhood was never intended to be a standalone service. So I'm looking forward to delving a little more into that later. I will pass it to Tia to introduce herself, or unless we want to go in order on the slide, in which we can go to Meg.
Either or, it doesn't matter. I guess I'll go since I'm already talking, and then we can go to Meg and then close it out with Anthony. So my name is Tia Taylor, and I'm going on about 8 years now as a senior program associate with WestEd. And my area of expertise is education finance, in particular state and federal programs. So my world has always been the ESSA world, if you will, and bridging the gaps between how we understand and think about our federal dollars and how we can align and coordinate those with our state dollars to ensure our children and our students get all of the services and the resources that they need in order to thrive. And braiding and blending is my favorite topic. So I'm super excited to be here with all of you today, along with my colleagues, and excited to share what it is we know in this space and to also learn from you all how we can help you find ways to expand the way you think about braiding and blending. So with that, I'll turn it over to Meg.
Thanks, Tia. Hi, everybody. I'm Meg Nelson. I'm a program associate in Leslie's content area at West Ed, so in the early childhood space, and I am a early childhood program person and related service provider by background. So before I came to West Ed about 2.5 years ago, I was the preschool coordinator for a local district in the great state of Massachusetts. And prior to that, I was the 619 coordinator for the state of Massachusetts for several years. And I always thought it was a lot of fun to develop and think about new programs, but then we go talk to the finance people and they would say, well, great, but how are we going to pay for that? And I'm like, that's why I'm talking to you. So, I have, since I've been at West Ed, have done more in the early childhood finance space, and I'm super excited to be here with you guys today and talk to my people who are, program people. It's always nice to talk to people who are in the field. And I had a lot of fun putting this together with Tia and Leslie. So thanks for the opportunity. And with that, I will turn it to Anthony.
Yeah, thanks, Meg. My name is Anthony Mukuna. I'm a senior project director here at West Ed, and I've been with the organization for over 4 years now. Prior to that, I used to work for the state of Idaho. I work with different state agencies. I was generally in charge of finance because accounting is my background. I'm an accountant, and I manage a federal grant for the for the Idaho Judicial Branch. And then I went to work for the Idaho Department of Education, and I spent 4 years there in charge of special education finance. And at West Ed, I do work within the special education policy and practice on a special education fiscal accountability area, but I also do a lot of work on school finance at West Ed that goes beyond IDEA. So I'm joining you here as the finance person. Thank you. That's all. Tia, back to you, I guess.
All right, sure. I can go ahead and lead us through. So today we're looking at, we have some session objectives that we'd like to accomplish with you all. And that's really, we're going to explore some different concepts around blending and braiding our federal dollars in order to support and sustain our programs. And also then to increase the knowledge of existing flexibilities that we have within each of our funding sources. And finally, just really exploring how we can apply those methods when we're looking to coordinate not only our federal dollars, but also our programs and services and the design and delivery of those programs and services to meet the needs of our children. So I think, sorry, I'm working on a few different things. So if you hear little clicks, it's because I'm trying to click my mouse and it's not letting me do that or advance the slides. All right, so our agenda is we're going to start off with looking at an overview of the federal funding sources that we have available to us at both the state and federal level. And then we're going to move into looking at braiding our state and federal funds. So really just gaining that understanding of the fundamentals and providing sort of a framework for you all to use when you're thinking about how to approach braiding as a strategy for resource allocation. And then we'll move into talking a little bit about sustaining those programs and what we're doing to ensure that we have the longevity of those programs should our funds expire. And then we'll hear from Meg and Leslie about some of those strategies to effectively support those inclusive programming. And we'll close off our time together with a whole group discussion, give you all time. We're going to give you time throughout to answer and ask questions. So when you see the little hand raising icon, please do feel free to come off mute and raise your hand or type in the chat along the way at any point in time. We're super open to engagement here, so and want you all to have the experience you want to have. Oops, wrong way. All right, so we're going to start off with a warm-up activity, and Leslie, feel free to jump in if you'd like, but we always like to start our presentations here with doing a warm-up around which animal best describes how you feel when someone mentions coordinating or braiding state and federal funds. And you can use either the Zoom annotate feature and or the chat just to pick the number and or the animal that best describes how you feel. Maybe you're a 1, you're a turtle, you're a little shy about blending and braiding. Maybe you're a monkey, you're somewhat curious, but a little surprised that you can even do this. Or maybe you're the dog, you're a little wondering like, huh, what is this all about? Or perhaps you're the cat, you're the curious cat, right? Or the dolphin, you're super excited about this and you just love the topic and you want to explore more about this. All right, cool. I see some 5s and some 2s.
Well, I laugh, Tia, because although the 4 of us as presenters have spent a good part of our careers learning and doing this work, I think I would always still say I'm kind of a 2, if not a 3. Like, okay, what? What's the question? Or let me double check. Like, I always find myself second guessing when it comes to decisions around how you can use funds, which funds are available to address which problem or question. So I can appreciate the 2s, 3s, and 5s here.
Yeah, I appreciate that too, Leslie. I always start off like thinking about in my head with the program piece as a 5, like, let's go do it. And then I'm like, well, can we do it? Then I end up as a 3. So yeah, right there with you.
Yeah, and I always feel like I always learn something new every time I present on this or talk about this, or I'm working with leaders in this space, because really, you know, the questions that were asked and where we are within our own journeys will kind of guide us and tell us or ask and force us to ask new questions to be innovative. And we always have to kind of ask ourselves, you know, is this allowable? And if not, why? And or why not? And how can we make it possible? So cool. Well, hopefully by the end of this, we're closer to a space where you're ready to jump in, or you're super excited like the dolphin. So thank you.
And
Go ahead.
thanks. Sorry, I just want, I know Leslie, you had asked if people could put kind of what they do in the chat, and that's really helpful. Rochelle, I see that you've put in here from the Hillsborough School District. Could you just tell me what the TOSA is? And then I saw that someone, Maddie, I think you're from Head Start. So
Yeah, so that's TOSA. It's just teacher on special assignment. So I'm a
Okay.
licensed teacher, but I work out of the administration building, helping to coordinate and administer the preschool programs.
Oh, cool. Great. And then Maddie, I see you're with Head Start, so that's great.
Sorry, my mouse. Okay, my mouse is doing fun things. I'm so sorry, you guys.
No, take your time, Tia. And because, well, and I think because we are utilizing translation services, I think if at any point in time you feel like we're talking too fast, that we need to slow down, that you'd like us to repeat something, please plop it in the chat, raise your hand, come off mute, whatever helps to make sure that that you're getting the information you need from our conversation today. For, you know, we prepared a really, you know, we have a lot of slides because we weren't quite sure exactly how many people would be here. So you kind of prepare for the more formal, but we have a nice intimate group here. So we can take this at a leisurely pace. We can go back and revisit things. Just let us know for sure.
Thank you, Leslie. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anthony to kick us off. So Anthony.
Yeah, thanks, Tia. I think the reason why Tia brings me here is usually because if she presents, she's gonna tell you that you can do anything you want with your money. I'm just joking. I'm the accountant, so that's my background. I used to be like that bad guy who would always tell program people, you know, you can't do that. You can't do that, right? But I just want to start with like putting the ground around like the reason why we have all these different supplemental education programs, like the IDEA program. So the reason why the federal government implemented program like the IDEA program and maybe some of the title program, it is because of the picture that you see in the screen. When you look at the difference between equality and equity. As you can see, the biggest difference is that when you practice equality, you're doing an equal distribution of your resources. Everybody gets the same, it doesn't matter what the outcome is. And that's the picture that you see on your left-hand side, I think, where you have the smallest kids on the top of one box who cannot watch the baseball game. Equity is on the other side, a more adequate distribution of resources based on the needs so that they can achieve the same outcome. And that's what you see, where we have a tall kid that did not need a box and is still able to watch the game. And then the small kids now is able to watch the game. That's pretty much the context of the reason why we have all these federal programs, like the IDEA program. Special education students, they come to the school, they're students, general education student first, but they come with some specific needs that needs additional resources. And then you need money to pay for those additional resources. That's the intent behind this. And if you go to the next slide, it's just a continuation of what I was saying. You have students in the education system, even in your early education world, that just need like basic support, universal support, because that is enough for them to be able to reach the desired outcome. And then you also have some children who might need supplemental support. And for those children, that means you probably need to invest to give them additional boxes to watch the baseball game. And you also have a group of students who might need even like specialized supports that are more complex and that could also cost more. So that's where you see that you have like this different layer of support that might be available in a school system depending on the needs of the students. Sometimes the universal support might be enough for the students to help them reach the desired outcome, but on occasion you might need to invest extra boxes for some of the students who come to the school system with differentiated needs. And that's why we have, like I said, all these different federal supplemental education programs like the IDEA program. And the federal governments fund this program through grant funding, the IDEA Part B grant. And when you receive, or when an entity receives those grants, there's this requirement where those funds are supposed to be used for like specific purposes. But at the same time, we've been hearing a lot about the need of coordination. When you talk about coordination, you cannot do a coordination if you don't do a coordination with the fund. And then that's what Tia is going to develop later on. But the problem is that those funds come to you with some requirements. So you have to be very careful. When you receive the IDEA Part B grants or any other grant to support those additional programs, you have to understand that they come with requirements. For example, in the IDEA world, this slide just gives you an example of what are the different laws and regulations that play a role in determining how those funds can be used. And as you can see here, we start with the IDEA law, the statutes. And then we have the IDEA implementing regulation. Then we have on the third layer, the Education Department General Administrative Regulation. So these are also additional sets of regulations that are applicable to those funds. And you also have the state's codes and rules, depending on which states where you're operating a program. So this just gives you an idea of how complex being in line with the requirement can be. So that's why when you think about the coordination of activity that leads to the coordination of funding or consolidation of funding, you have to keep that in mind. So that's the reason why I said Tia brought me here, because I just wanted to give this disclaimer before you start having the nice conversation about what are the new ideas. But the good news is that even though this regulation or this law comes with some restrictions, they also come with flexibilities that sometimes are not used because people are afraid of the potential consequences. And when you come to, do you have a question? Oh, we can go to the next slide. So when you come to the IDEA world, there is this concept of least restrictive environment requirement under IDEA that is very connected to the idea of the coordination of activities. Because under the IDEA implementing regulation, children should be considered general education students first. Before they are students with disabilities, they are general education students first. So organizations, school districts should do everything they have in their power to make sure that those children are given the opportunity to learn with their non-disabled students. Unless they have a disability that kind of forces you to take additional measures. If you can put in place some accommodation that can assist or help children receive their education within the same environment with their non-disabled students or peers, that's the ideal scenario. But by doing it, it might also require like more coordination of activities. And then, like I said, you cannot coordinate activities if you don't think about the coordination of the funding, despite all these different restrictions they put on those funding. And if we go to the next slide. So this is just a summary of what I was saying. Yeah, you have the grants to pay for those programs because students with disabilities have additional needs. It's important to understand the requirements because those requirements also come with flexibility that you can take advantage of. And then when you think about the coordination or the consolidation of funds, the mindset is to start by identifying what are the needs. And Tia will get into that. Instead of starting to think about, oh, what can I do with my funds? What can I do with my money? It's better to start by understanding like, what are our student needs? And from there, determine how you can pay or fund the needs of the students. But always remember that the restrictions also exist so that you don't take the risk of misusing the funds. So that's what I wanted to say before I let you dive into the conversation. Tia, anything else you need to add?
No, thank you, Anthony. I just always appreciate you grounding us and reminding us that we do have to be in compliance with our uniform grant guidance and EDGAR and any of the federal regulations or state regulations of our funding. But like Anthony says, like there's always a way to make it possible, and I'll find the way to make it possible, but he'll help us make sure that we're in compliance, and Meg and Leslie are going to help us with that as well. So Leslie, I think I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Yes, and so I normally am not one to populate the chat box much during these things because I find it distracting when I see the little light right up, but I really appreciate you giving us a little context about your roles, at least in terms of who's on today's call. We realize that others who are not on the meeting will be listening to the recording and have access and may have different roles, but I think it's always helpful to understand that that when we talk about the federal dollars that come from IDEA, you know, as a result of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, you know, that's a civil right, and it does bring with it very sometimes restrictions, but also requirements on how those funds can be used. And this language is unfamiliar to people who work regularly within state school systems, right? But if you're not part of the state school system, then you probably are not as familiar with some of the funding language and the requirements that are tied to how you can use the dollars. So please jump in if you have any questions. Because when we talk about supporting children in inclusive practices. I'm going to deviate just a little bit from this lovely slide that ECTA has developed and that you can find also on their website, which I'm sure is somewhere cited. But you know, it's important to remember that Part C of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is birth to 3, so that's infants and toddlers, up to the age of 3, are served under a different component of IDEA. And every state determines its own eligibility criteria. And every state has somewhat of a different process for determining eligibility for Part C special education services, so those birth to 3 services. And then you get to your 3 to 21-year-old services, which are IDEA Part B of the statute. And there's a little more uniformity in eligibility. The different categories for eligibility, the processes may differ a little bit state to state, but there's a certain degree of consistency that's not necessarily seen in the birth to 3 space. But I think what you know, but just in case you needed a reminder, is that, for instance, Head Start and Early Head Start have a different eligibility kind of band for how they identify delay, right? So a child may be identified as having a delay and not qualify for special education services under Part C or preschool special education. That doesn't mean they don't have developmental needs, it just means they don't meet that particular eligibility criteria. So there's been a lot of discussion, for example, about what we mean by delay or disability, because the IDEA funds that Anthony just briefly touched on are explicitly intended for children who qualify for IDEA special education services. But you may have other children who have developmental needs, and but then you just have other resources that are drawn from to ensure they're getting the appropriate supports. Because, for instance, Head Start, Early Head Start, I think it's what, 10% of children in your classrooms or in enrollment or should be children who have developmental delays or disabilities. But that's based on the Head Start criteria and not necessarily the state IDEA eligibility process. Is that clear as mud? I'm going to ask Rachel or Maddie or someone, just give me a thumbs up if that makes sense. Okay. Because I know from your perspectives, you may be thinking of a bigger group of children than those who are who are primarily eligible under special education. But these principles still apply to those kiddos. I think that the principles of understanding exactly what Anthony just said, what are the needs of the child and family? Because, of course, in early childhood, we think families. What are the needs of the child and family? And then what are the funding sources that can be leveraged to help meet those individualized needs is just a great starting point. And part of that from your roles may be helping your school systems or your Part C program, which in Oregon is part of the school system, to know what they too could do with their dollars. Because a lot of times people create their budgets for the IDEA funds, these funds that come down from the Department of Education, and they just sort of stick with sort of similar numbers for similar categories like transportation or equipment or professional development, because they're not aware of the flexibilities that may be there. And they learn the job from whoever they had the job from the last time. So they just do it the same way because they don't want to do it wrong. And so we spend a lot of time, and if you're from a childcare program or another home visiting program or an early Head Start or Head Start program, often we understand what they could do with their dollars a lot better than people who have suddenly stepped into that role, especially if they're fiscal managers and not programmatic people. So, you know, I think it's just really, it's helpful to know the terminology of IDEA, even if you're thinking about a broader group of children. So I'm sorry, if we'll go back to you just to that slide. I also just want to touch on like what we have laid out here in this lovely graphic is that you have different sources of funding based on different departments and different legislative acts and initiatives. And so this is just a very succinct way of just sort of letting you know from the U.S. Department of Education, you have the opportunity that comes into your state. And then I want to be mindful of, we didn't explicitly say this in the beginning, but I appreciate the acknowledgement of tribal nations. Reservation schools also get funding through the Bureau of Indian Education. And they get these federal dollars as well that get sent to their point of contact at the Department of Interior. And they get funneled and channeled to reservation schools. So we don't talk about that a lot, but these principles, once again, apply. They apply if we're talking about native lands or indigenous communities, or if you have a Head Start program on a reservation, for example. If you have a school that's providing education services, then they also provide special education services. So I just like to acknowledge that in principle, when we say state, we could also be referencing what is channeled through the Bureau of Indian Education. They have parallel processes. But I just want to acknowledge here and just see if anybody, not to call anybody out or make you uncomfortable, but we have different, I have to look at my little graphic with my glasses on, sorry. I am now of that age where smaller print necessitates a little assistance here, but you know, IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and Congress decides based on a formula how much money a given state will receive. So that's determined by the Congress and the U.S. Department of Education. And so that funding comes in annually. The states submit a grant application. There's one that's submitted for the Birth to 3 program, and then there's one that's submitted for the 3 to 21 program. So you have two different funding streams that come in under IDEA into your state. But when we think of early childhood, we're often thinking birth through 5 or birth through age 8, depending on your program, right? And so at any given point, you could have two different IDEA grant awards that could be of interest and use for supporting the services needed for infants and toddlers and preschoolers. Then there are the Title I dollars that come in as well. And so, you know, and those are tied to Title I criteria in the legislation, right? So, and then you have preschool development grants. So if you look at that top bar, you'll see U.S. Department of Education, and then ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, preschool development grants for birth to 5. These are block grants. So states apply for them. They put together a proposal. And so not every state has a preschool development grant. Not every state receives a preschool development grant. Some states, I won't call out anybody for any particular reason, but for instance, I know that this particular past go around, for example, Maryland did not receive a preschool development grant. So it had one for many years. So these are not guaranteed funds. And I think that's an important part. IDEA, for the most part, are guaranteed funds. You may want more, but it's a civil right. It's tied to legislation, and as long as states submit an approvable grant application, then they will receive their funds. But preschool development grant funds include birth to 3 more than they used to, but are primarily focused on ages 3 to 5. And the state decides its needs. And these may go to your state education agency, or they may go to your Department of Developmental Services, or they may go to your Health and Human Services agency. So the agency that receives the preschool development grant may not be the one that your program answers to in kind of the hierarchy or chain of command, so to speak. So it's important to know what the preschool development grant application includes, because some have, for instance, a real big emphasis on just supporting and expanding access to early care and learning education. Some focus on workforce initiatives, recruiting a more diverse and qualified workforce to represent diverse communities. Some have an emphasis on infant and early childhood mental health. So they may not explicitly talk about inclusion of children with delays or disabilities, but they are intended to help support all services for children, including those who have delays or disabilities. So the preschool development grants are a unique funding source that are jointly administered by the Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And then, of course, we get over to those that are more explicitly supported by Health and Human Services, and probably you could speak very robustly to these as well. But we do have Head Start funds, which include Early Head Start. And as you know, those are also block grants. So not every district has a Head Start or Early Head Start program within a state. So that gets into, these are funds that if you have a Head Start and Early Head Start program, then you can work with those program administrators to think about the successful inclusion of children with delays and disabilities in those services. That could be a placement decision as part of an IEP that services that, the child will attend the Early Head Start or Individualized Family Service Plan, Individualized Education Program, but depending on whether they're birth to 3 or 3 to 5. But when we're talking about where services will take place, the location could be a child care or a Head Start, Early Head Start program. And then IDEA funds are used to help support services there. Or there could be some kind of joint delivery of participation in multiple settings. And then you're thinking about which funding source can best be used to address those needs. But as I mentioned, not every state has IDEA services. Not every state or locality within every state has a Head Start or an Early Head Start program. So that's where it gets into your own understanding of your community and the resources that may be available in your community that are different than what could even be 10 miles down the road, for example, in a different zip code, a different district. Medicaid, for example, is a great funding source that can be utilized to help pay for services. But of course, Medicaid is an entitlement based on eligibility criteria. So not every family has access to Medicaid, and a state's Medicaid agreements are negotiated as to exactly what will be paid for. So what one state will pay for in terms of services, whether it's occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, developmental supportive services, early intervention specialists, social work, nutrition services, assistive technology, all of those things are negotiated at the state level with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And so understanding what Medicaid will reimburse for is very, very different state to state. And so when you have families, for example, that move from one state to another, they may have received services that were billable to Medicaid in another state, but aren't in Oregon, or vice versa, for example. So understanding that Medicaid is a resource, but it's not a financial resource available to all children we serve, because it's intended primarily to support those who are at a certain poverty level, economic and income level. And so anyway, I'm going through it into a lot of detail, but it's really just to kind of point out that we also can get into private insurance. Some states have memorandums of agreement with insurance companies, and families give permission to bill their private insurance for some services. In some states, for birth to 3 services, there's a cost share. So families pay a monthly, kind of like a deductible, a monthly maximum of $50 or $200 or something that they pay as a co-share for their birth to 3 services. And then there are some states where everything is paid through state dollars, through state and federal dollars. So understanding what's available to you within your state And then what's also unique within your community is part of the process of knowing what's the landscape of resources, right? I'm going to pause. Is there a question, or would anyone like me to elaborate on anything? I don't see a question in the chat. And these are just dollars we're talking about, because Tia is going to get into what we mean by resources in another minute. So, okay, the next slide. This breaks it down just slightly differently, but you kind of get the sense, because we're looking at the big picture, your federal dollars, and then we think about what's up, you know, your state dollars, what are local dollars. And depending on your program, and I often say which God you answer to, whether you answer to more the Health and Human Services oversight or the Department of Education oversight, you still have the same funding sources to consider, but your authority and autonomy to access and use them is different. So they will always require that kind of understanding of the partnership program and who your point of contact is. Because if you are a child care program and you receive a child care block grant to help supplement your work, and you really want to make sure you're providing high quality care experiences to children who also have delays or disabilities and their families, you're going to need different advocacy if you want to engage with your special education services with the school, or your Part C services with the state education agency, because you're going to want to explain how they should be using their dollars to help support services in this environment, which is an inclusive natural environment, right? But a lot of times that means you have to go knocking on their door. Because they don't tend to volunteer where they're, sending their monies to other places, right? However, if you're, for instance, I was a birth to 3 provider, and we provide services in natural environments. So that could be their child care program, that could be an early Head Start classroom-based program, and we work in tandem with them. So my agency paid for me to go provide services in those environments. But I'm one person providing one set of specialized skills. And so you may need other supports that aren't provided by the Part C program, but are intended to help support that child. And so understanding the roles and responsibilities of these different initiatives, and then what dollars that they get to help do their work, is it's a bit of homework, but it really can often be great, because it helps you make the right connections with the right people who understand all these different plans and initiatives and stuff that come in, some that are consistent over time and some that are very short term. Like if you think about your American Rescue Plan dollars that your state got, ARPA dollars, very short term, a finite amount of money for a one-time thing, right? So you don't want to plan a whole program around that and not have other sources of funding identified to keep sustainability in place or to keep momentum and growth going. Whereas others, like the IDEA dollars, have a degree of consistency and predictability to them.
And I would just, sorry, Leslie, just add.
Yeah, please.
With the state funding too, a lot of times there's state grants and state dollars available to do things that are a little more creative and then specific and tailored to your state, that allow you to, kind of maximize your federal dollars where they need to be, but then, really support creative programming. And I know Oregon, I was just poking around on you guys' sites, and you have some interesting kind of state grant opportunities that, if you're not familiar with, encourage you to kind of look into. There's Preschool Promise is one that I found, but then also that Early Childhood Equity Fund. So there's some really interesting things going on in states, and I would encourage you to kind of look to those things, or find out who the people are in your district or your program or your system that can help maybe explore that opportunity for you. So that's it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, if we don't have any questions about the different sources of funding that can support IDEA services or children who have identified delays or disabilities, I will then pass it back to Tina.
Oh, I'll take it. Thank you so much. And I'm also just learning a lot from you too about all of these different fundings specific to our early childhood. So thank you for sharing all of that information. So a lot of times, when we think about our resources, we think about funding as our primary resource, as Leslie was sharing. But really, when I think about resources, I like to think of them as what it is the funding becomes. And I frame it as educational resources beyond funding. So you see a few buckets of categories here. And if you're a finance person, you'll see that these kind of align to what we call our object and function codes, if you will. But when we think about resources beyond funding, we're really thinking about those investments that we need in order for both our children as well as our staff to really thrive. And these include things like our human resources, the organization of time, our equipment, materials, and supplies, the programs and services that we design and deliver, as well as our community collaboration and partnerships, probably our most important, one of our more important resources. But the most valuable resource, again, is our human resources. And this is where we're really thinking about the staff that we are recruiting and retaining and supporting their professional experience and ensuring that they're able to become highly qualified and experienced through their professional journey. Our children are also a very valuable resource and probably underutilized, I would offer, and can offer some really valuable information on what it is they need, perhaps what's working or what's not working. That might be itty bitty still, but I mean, kids will tell you what they want and what they need. If anyone is going to be really honest, it's going to be them. Our organization of time. This is a resource where we are looking at how we are providing our staff sufficient time to collaborate, to engage in professional learning, to do their own planning time to ensure that they're able to offer the things that they need to offer our students and children. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Our equipment, materials, and supplies. This might seem obvious, but it is something that we can use to really enhance the design and delivery of our programs, and often is just seen as that thing that we always get, but really is a resource that is available to us. Our programs and services that we provide, these can be really leveraged to provide our children with those services that they need using whole child supports. So we're looking at our SEL supports, the social emotional supports, our English learner supports, and of course our special education services that our students might need. And finally, our community collaboration and partnerships, right? These are, I would say, those external resources that we want to leverage in order to support our system and enhance the design and delivery of our programs and services. And this includes how we might engage our families, building our relationships with our community-based organizations, thinking about, external service providers that can offer the things that we might not be able to offer. Either we don't have the capacity to offer, or we don't receive funding to offer those things. So thinking about how we might generate and cultivate those relationships to help us realize the things that we want and need to do for our children. So when we're thinking about maximizing our resources, to maximize the impact, we really want to think about how we're structuring these to be efficient, effective, and economical within our system. And I'm just going to touch on a few of these. And Leslie, as I wrap up, I'm going to ask you to chime in a little bit more to expand. But the way I like to think about maximizing our resources here is when we're thinking about our school calendars or our classroom schedules. This is where we were talking about that organization of time, where we can embed within those schedules, those professional development days or professional learning days, or collaboration time within that schedule. We might, if we're in a K-12 space, think about how we're looking for absentee hotspots, or even in this space where we're looking at program hours to ensure that our students and our children have access and are able to participate in the programs that we're offering for as many hours or days as possible. We might think about professional learning communities and our peer observations, again, to kind of create those opportunities where our educators can learn from each other and really strengthen that culture of learning so that we're sharing our best practices with each other and that we're supporting each other again in our professional journeys. Looking at the before and after school programs or the enrichment and summer school programs, these, might be more specific to K-12, but I think they can speak to us as well, right? This provides our children with those opportunities to really engage in personalized learning or enrichment activities to expand what it is we are trying to offer. We're looking at the equitable distribution of staff. So I think about this as how we're allocating our staff to provide our classroom services, our program services rather. We don't want to staff all of our newer teachers in a perhaps a high needs classroom, right? We want to make sure that we're partnering them with a more experienced educator or coach or a TOSA perhaps, right? To help them ensure that they are successful in that space. And of course, our community organizations, right? Again, we can't do everything. And if there's anything that I've learned in the last few years is that we can't do things alone. So again, there might be services that we need to provide that an outside provider may be able to help us to shoulder that those supports or those services. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but just some examples of ways that we can leverage resources in different ways. Leslie, I don't know if there's anything coming up for you before we move on that you might want to add to this as you're thinking about this for.
That I think maybe Meg might have something as well.
Yeah.
I think what can be really interesting, particularly when we're talking about early childhood. So in birth to 3 programs, including Part C of IDEA, the home visiting program, we write family goals, right? Like there are children, but we're not working with the child or with the child in isolation. We're really working within the child's family home and then wherever they may spend their day. So childcare or early Head Start or, Gymboree, wherever the parent may be and take their child. And they write family goals and they really include some family outcomes. And so a lot of our resources are directed at actually supporting parents. But that doesn't sound good to funders. Like for some reason, they don't buy into, they don't believe us when we say that 60 years of research, 70 years of research of Bronfenbrenner and ecological theory has told us that, trust me, we have to understand the context, right? And we have to provide the support. So for instance, when Tia was talking about how there can be great resources, for instance, dual language learners or English language learners, seize them because for some reason, oh, thank you, Maddie. Seize them because those are great resources because there will be children with delays or disabilities who are also dual language learners or English language learners, right? So really kind of understanding the unique needs of a child and family can sometimes help you really think about, going back to Anthony's initial point, okay, who has money that's supposed to help them because of these particular characteristics or demographic, qualities. I think that's just really an important piece to think about. In Head Start, you think about, the broader community needs, that you have family goals and objectives as part of, your just lesson plans and working with parents. Other home visiting programs, the McKeevy home visiting programs, think about families. Preschool IDEA services do not think about families. Like they just don't. It bugs me out the wahoo, but they don't include family goals and objectives, which is unfortunate in my mind. Like if I could wave my magic wand, that would be something that we would do, because we know that between the ages of birth and age 7, they're still teaching us what they need. We're still learning about what's going on with this particular child's development and growth and what we may have some influence over to help a more optimal trajectory, right? And optimal is defined by a parent, by their community, by their culture and their values. So I'm not saying fix the child. I am saying that we work with families to think about, what do you want for your child and their experiences, and how can we help? And we're still learning a lot about them, which is why we know it's important to have consistent routines, consistent care, quality, developmentally appropriate materials and resources, adequate nutrition. Like, we know all these things. So our early childhood programs address these broader factors in different ways, because we're still learning about, well, what's going on that we can influence in a positive way, while this child is still growing into the young person they're going to be. So I'll just say that, understanding the different resources. So it's important to understand food stamps and TANF and other things, because we know that a nourished body learns and can grow, and an undernourished body won't. So, but sometimes families don't know how to access those services. So the service coordination we provide is so critical as well.
And
Meg, what would you
think-
add?
Yeah, just going with the family and parent theme, I think recognizing parents and families as resources themselves that can be utilized to support your programming, especially in this early childhood space. I mean, they're wonderful teachers to each other. And so having parent-to-parent groups, or kind of, in some cases, cultural brokers for families is really important and can really go a long way in supporting programming overall for young children. So that's it.
Thank you, guys. I have some things to add to my list. So with that, I think, and Leslie, you can help here as well, but do we want to just hear from you? And feel free to either type in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself. We're a small group, so you can just unmute yourself. But, you know, what are some other resources beyond funding that come to mind as we've been talking?
I know Rachel and Laura, since you're the only two explicit participants, the pressure is on, and yet it's not, because I think we could edit out stuff if you don't like what you say.
Well, you just reminded me that we're being recorded.
I'm sorry.
No, you already talked about community partnerships, but I would like to say, share how powerful that is in practice. So here in the Hillsborough School District, we have 23 preschool programs in our buildings, but 16 of those are actually ran by our community partner organizations. Funding a preschool program through the district is very expensive because of contracts and staffing costs and all of these things too. So how we're able to offer those additional classrooms is partner with community organizations who are interested in offering preschool experiences. So they actually are receiving the funding, and then the school district provides the space at no charge, tech support, nutrition services, custodial services, coaching. And so we're able to really maximize that funding that's coming into our county and into our community. And we're able to serve, 3 times the number of families that we would be able to, were the district trying to do it on our own. So that has been a really, really, really powerful, just seeing, how many more families and children we can support just by each doing what we, giving what we have, I guess, or what we can provide.
I think that's a great example, Rachel, and it's a great prime for what's next in the content around the difference between blending funds and braiding funds, because when you have the option of just pulling your financial resources together and entrusting someone else to use them thoughtfully to meet the needs of many children, That is a true blessing for sure. And it does, I mean, it makes so much sense, right? It just makes so much sense. The challenge, of course, is that a lot of times each of these different funding streams bring with them really very specific criteria about who they can be used for and under what circumstances. And they bring with them a certain accountability around tracking the use of each dollar and ensuring, for instance, an example that comes up in our early intervention space is a lot of times, you know, we're a small program that's part of a bigger system. So if we just wanted to buy a copy machine, but we also were sharing an office with, let's say, our new parent support home visiting program. Well, we have to be very clear that if we're going to use the IDEA dollars to buy this darn copy machine, that either no one else is using it, or if they are, they're providing their own paper and they're chipping in for the toner and the like, you know, it's an interesting, you know, you can't just buy a laminator. You have to say how the laminator is going to be used to support children with delays or disabilities as its primary. I mean, and so that makes it so much like these are reasonable barriers because people want to make sure the dollars are being used for what they're planned for and who they're entitled to be used for. But it's wonderful when you can come up with great local initiatives. And this is really where your state and local dollars can really kick in. Because they don't have the same rigid requirements around who they can be used for and why they can be used and what you can't do with them, as explicitly stated.
Yeah, and the another program that we're pretty proud about was partnering with our ESD, so they get the bulk of the ECSI funding because they manage our early intervention special education for until children get to kindergarten. And so we were able to do a program. All of our classrooms are inclusive, but this was a special pilot program. So the ESD was placing 5 students with autism, and so they actually, the way that we were able to do this particular program and have the coaching for 2 years was they provided their early special education staff. They paid their wages. The school district provided the classroom and additional staff members. So we were able to fill the rest, you know, the 13 more spots with gen ed students. So, and then it's just a beautiful program.
Oh, absolutely. It sounds like, well, and I think, you know, Oregon has such a long history of valuing early childhood, right? I mean, you know, it's not a birth mandate state, but it has it kind of has a birth mandate, you know, attitude around faith being available at birth, around ensuring these strong connections in its early childhood systems, and promoting workforce diversity. I know there are a lot of great projects and activities taking place. And so I think that just plays out in the, you know, in some of the creativity that then you can do with your dollars. But I think even going back to understanding resources, what you said, it's not just about having another human being there, right? You have to have a human being there that knows how to coach. You have to have a human being there that has the experience to understand, you know, that is it's not a tangible resource that you can say, all right, I'm going to guarantee that just by filling this position description that they're actually going to have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to connect and teach and coach. That's a different resource, and making decisions about how you use the time of the staff you have and the expertise they bring to the table is also a decision about resource allocation. It has nothing to do with paying for their time. It has to do with they can't be in 3 places at the same time. So where are we going to send Leslie? Where are we going to send Tia? Where are we going to send Rochelle? Where, you know, and how do we know that that's going to be a good use of the resources they bring that come from a career of doing the work? Not just education, but just the doing. It's important. That's leadership, and leadership is a resource for sure.
Yes, it is a resource. Michelle, I feel like you've given some really great examples of practices you've already been implementing, but we're gonna transition here to just to give some of those that might not know the more of the fundamentals about how we think about this. And this is just again a framework of what it is, how we think about braiding our state and federal dollars. So no fast or hard rules around here. But we always start this conversation by grounding it in reorienting the planning mindset. And Anthony started off mentioning this at the beginning when he was talking about all of the compliance pieces. And this shift that we talk about is really enabling us from shifting from planning for compliance towards planning for performance. So often when we're planning for compliance, we tend to operate from this space of the allowable use of our funds as the driver and how we plan and allocate resources and for the design and delivery of our programs. But when we're transitioning towards performance, we're really starting out with our identified needs as the driver and how we plan and allocate our resources and for the design and delivery of our programs and services, and then find that available funding and or resources that we have available to us to pay for those programs and services. I kind of like to frame this as the money no longer tells us what we can and cannot do, but rather we need to know how to tell the money what we need and want it to do. And in doing so, we adopt a needs-based approach to planning. So this essentially is a 3-step process, real simple. It kind of models what we just talked about, but we're really starting with using data to identify and prioritize the needs of our children, of our families, and our staff. And from there, we're able to plan out the design and delivery of our programs and services using that data to ensure that the actions and services and programs that we're providing are actually meeting the needs that we've identified. I think the majority of our funding sources, especially our federal funds, require some type of comprehensive needs assessment in order to spend those dollars. So this is the way in which we do that. And then from there, we can decide whether or not we are able to coordinate or braid our funds and or consolidate any of our funds to help pay for those things. So some of the questions we might ask, when we're considering these, especially those resources beyond funding that we might need to consider, is really looking at what services our children need, right? And looking at and asking ourselves things like, does our child have exceptional needs? Is our child an English learner? Is our child experiencing homelessness, or are they in foster care? There's all types of questions that we need to be asking ourselves that go beyond a needs assessment. And I don't know, maybe we want to type some of those questions in the chat, or Leslie, you want to offer a few there. But really, we're thinking about just what else do we need to know beyond what the needs assessment might be telling us. And when we're thinking about blending and braiding, we first find it helpful to really understand the difference between the basis of our funding versus the purpose of our funding. So when we think about the basis of our funding, this is a really highly technical accounting term that we use, and Anthony can confirm, where we need to recognize our revenues and expenditures within our financial statements. And oftentimes in education, this is a per pupil amount or a per child or student group amount that we receive on all those funding sources that Leslie talked about back on slide 14 and 15. But when we think about the purpose of that funding or each of those funding sources, I like to say, when we wipe away all the sections and subsections and subsections of our regulations, right? At the end of the day, these dollars are intended to improve outcomes for our children and to increase and improve services for our children that need additional supports. And on the flip side of that, it's also those related supports that our educators need in order to bring this all together. So, and I'll just go back to this really quickly, like my prime example here, and I know I use Title I as this example, but our basis is the number of students that qualify for free and reduced price meals, Whereas the purpose of that funding is really to ensure that any low-performing student attending a Title I school is receiving the academic and behavioral supports that they need to improve their educational experience. So it's very different than the actual basis in which they're getting it. It may be that that child qualifies for free and reduced price meals, but in fact, they are an A+ student, right? So there's different ways that our basis and purpose might not technically always align. And so what funds can we, or what do we mean, sorry, by braiding and blending? So when we talk about braiding, we're talking about a resource allocation method where we are coordinating different funding sources to support the design and delivery of our programs and services to meet one overarching purpose. And Rochelle gave some really great examples just a moment ago of that. But in this case, our individual funding streams maintain their award-specific identity for both eligibility as well as reporting. So nothing changes on our accounting end, but when we do coordinate our services and our funding, that's where we're changing the experience of our students and our staff. When we're talking about blending, this is a resource allocation method where we are consolidating allowable funding sources into a pool of funds, and also to meet one overarching purpose. And these individual funding sources then lose their award-specific identity for eligibility and reporting. So which funds can we braid or blend? Well, I'm going to offer that we can braid virtually any and all available funding source that we receive. And I would also offer that the federal government in particular advocates for us to braid our funds. And then Leslie started off our conversation today with saying that our early childhood programs aren't intended to be solely funded with a single funding source. So we are, I can't think of any rules or regulations that say you cannot braid your funds together. And again, we should. Whereas on the blending side, we can only blend certain funds, and in particular, only funds that are administered by the Department of Education. And to build on that even more, you would only consolidate or blend funds if you were operating a Title I school-wide program. So you'll often hear these terms used interchangeably, but we wanted to just provide a distinction between the two. And for today, we're only going to be focusing on braiding because our funds that we are working with only allow for us to braid. All right, so let's dive in. So when we are braiding funds, we find it helpful to organize our funds into layers. So our first layer being our universal layers, and this is our universal funds rather. And these include our general funds or local funds. Essentially, this is our unrestricted funds, if you will. You can pretty much do whatever you want with these funds. There's no real rules around what you can and cannot do, and they're often reserved for the basic services that we are providing. In our second layer, this represents our supplemental funds, and this includes our directed state funds. So perhaps some type of fund that funds we might receive that are specific to English learners or to low performing children or our special education services from our state. This also includes our federal funds that we talked about. And really, these funds are intended to increase and improve our services for children that are either historically underserved or in need of accommodations. And then finally, we have our third layer. And this represents what I would call our specialized funds. These are funds that are often really restricted in nature, or they're one-time in nature, or they have really specific reporting requirements or rules around what you can and cannot, mostly cannot do with those funds. So I like to put them in what I call that specialized fund category. Now, again, don't attach any hard and fast rules to this. This is more just a concept for you all to help us, organize our funds in order of flexibility or what it is they might be able to do, what they might be able to do for us. So when we think about braiding again is that resource allocation method that allows us to coordinate our available funds to support one overarching purpose. So we can braid funds from all 3 layers. We can braid funds across 2 layers, and we can braid funds within a single layer. So depending on what it is we've identified as our need, or priority areas that we need to focus on, will help us determine which layers we can coordinate in order to expand the depth and breadth of what it is we're trying to accomplish. So you'll see kind of on the right-hand side in that box, we have program services A, B, C, and D. So perhaps when I'm thinking about how I'm going to fund these, I'm thinking of my universal funds as able to pay for services A, B, and C. And then moving on to my supplemental funds, I'm going to add on to those services B and C using my supplemental funds. And then with my specialized funds, I'm going to supplement a portion of the services I'm providing for C and then only pay for D with my specialized funds. So it's just kind of example of a way you're coordinating a bunch of different funding streams to pay for multiple services within a single program. I would say that, it's important when we are braiding that we honor any supplement, not supplant provisions, right? We know that those exist, and we need to, I would say that as long as we can ensure that we are always in alignment with the intent and the purpose of the funding sources that we are using, we will most likely, not be supplanting our funds. We don't want to end up with any tangles in our braids, and we don't want Anthony, coming up for a visit, because when he comes to visit us, then we might have some problems. But anyway, so again, understanding what we're trying to do will help us determine where we start with our braids, with braiding our funds. I don't know, Leslie, Meg, Anthony, is there anything you want to add before we talk about sustainability?
Well, yeah, let me ask you, I'll walk you through kind of how I see this as an example, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, because I could be. Because I'll be talking a little bit of outside my comfort zone. Because let's say we have an early Head Start program. You have an early Head Start classroom, infants, toddlers, sweet little babies coming in a couple of days a week at your center. Your universal funds that you receive just to support your early Head Start program is there for all of the children in that classroom, period. You may get additional monies to support children who happen to have delays or disabilities and are enrolled in your early Head Start program. So that would be your supplemental funds for B and C. But then Part C, IDEA, if they're providing services or supports to a child who is enrolled in your program, they may bring in some additional monies through their funding streams. But those are very specific specialized funds. Those are the D. So that child is receiving services and supports from, of course, the programmatic funds available to all children in the program, and some additional funds that are identified and targeted for a child who may have a delay or disability, and the IDEA funds that are administered through a different organization. Would that be an example of how you could braid funds to support a specific child within a program?
I mean, I would say that's a perfect example of how you could do that.
And then the real challenge comes in is then you are documenting the use of those different dollars, because you're going to have to explain to somebody at some point how much money was used, what it was used for, and more importantly for the Part C program, that those dollars were not basically being dropped into the universal pot. So it's more like, I like chunky soups where I can tell if I'm having a bell pepper or an onion versus a smoothie where it's all in there, and the flavors may be there, but I can't tell which piece of it is.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I would like to add to, and I think this gets to Rochelle's example earlier, all of the different activities that they were offering and providing. While we're designing programs and services and looking at the individual needs of our individual students and our children, when we're bringing it all together, all of our children within that program can benefit from these programs and services. It's not designed to just, I don't like to use the word target, but that's just what's coming to my mind for a moment. You know, we don't design it to target the one child, but we use that information or that data to design those programs and services so that not only will that child thrive, but also all of our children will thrive. Because what the needs of one student might be also the needs of another student that we just don't know about yet, right? And if we're thinking about the design and delivery of that, where we're addressing multiple needs within a single program rather than just a few needs within a single program. So, I mean, I can go on and on forever, but I feel like we have 3 minutes and I don't know. So I just want to talk about sustainability really quick, because I think this gets to, you know, what we want to talk about. And I might want to, I'm going to burn through this really quickly and so that we can get to Meg to give some examples. But
You're
really,
fine, you're fine, Tia. Keep.
all right. So, you know,
I think sustainability is important, like, and so I, you know, talk through that because Rochelle has already given a great example of braiding, and I can go through mine pretty quick, so.
all right, great, thank you. All right, so during COVID, you know, WestEd partnered with Education Resource Strategies, or otherwise known as ERS, to develop what we call these approaches to sustainability. And we talked about a little bit earlier, you know, that at any given moment, we might experience a significant increase in the funding that we receive, and on the flip side, a significant decrease. So we've always got to be prepared in thinking about what it is we're doing and how we're paying for it, and in order to sustain our programs. So, you know, there's going to be a portion of our funds where, or the things that we are trying to accomplish, where we're going to ramp up and roll back our funds. And these might be one-time expenditures, or the nature of our grant that we receive is a one-time grant. So it's going to be that short-term or one-time investment that we're making. There might be a portion of whatever it is we're trying to accomplish where we are going to need to seek additional funds. You know, we know already that this is working, or that we want to keep this going, but we have it on our radar that we're going to have to seek more funds when this grant or this funding runs out. There is also you know, the time where we're going to have to make trade-offs, right? We're going to have to really look at what it is we're doing and whether or not we are actually seeing the outcomes, or desired outcome that we are hoping to achieve. And we might have to get rid of some of those programs, right? You know, that this is the way we've always done it. Doesn't work anymore, right? We know better now, and especially given COVID and all the different things, like there are some things that we have to let go of and be prepared to have those conversations. And along the way, of course, as we're investing in all of these things, you know, we're looking to, as we're building capacity of our staff and our educators and the programs that we're investing in, they become natural parts of our routine and the things that we are offering and providing. And that's what helps us generate that sustainability and innovation within the programs that we are designing and delivering. And so I guess I would just offer that, you know, you're going to likely have a combination of all 4 of these approaches when you're thinking about the funding, the programs and services that you all are offering. So they aren't, you know, I know these are COVID examples, and I apologize, I need to update my graphics here, but I just wanted to share, you know, that you're going to be doing a lot of different things when you're thinking about blending and braiding and sustaining your programs. And I don't know, Leslie or Meg, I can turn it over to you now, but I just want to close on this thought that at the end of the day, really what we're looking at is how we are improving the educational experience of our students. And that's what it's all about. I think that's what we're all here for. And braiding is one of those things that can help us accomplish multiple things all at once. And I will say what Anthony has shared at the beginning, you know, my mantra in this space is that we don't ever say no to something, but rather that we try to find a way to make it possible. And it might be that it is no with a particular funding source, but we can find a way to make it possible for our students. And Anthony, I saw you came off mute, so if you want to.
I was gonna say that's the reason why I like to speak before you. So
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to kind of wrap up. The examples that are in the slides are pretty self-explanatory in terms of how to braid funds and be creative around personnel. And we are, a minute past time, and I know these people probably have kids to get back to. But Rochelle, and I applaud your example around braiding. I mean, that's a lovely program. It sounds like you have there, and what an opportunity for all the children in your district to be in a setting that's sounds truly inclusive. So that's great. So that's all I had to say. I mean, I could say more, but we're at past time.
Our pastime. I'm gonna fast forward us then just to the end. We did have some questions for you all, so just think about these things as you're moving forward in your work, and please do, there's also always barriers, challenges, but there's always solutions. So if you ever need help in thinking about those, please do reach out to us. We also have, if you want to learn more about finance and school finance, Anthony is our director in this space. And I don't know, Anthony, if you want to say a few words about this. We'll send an email with some links to these registration. I can put it in the chat, but I don't know, Anthony, you want to say something about this?
Yeah, if you want to learn more about finance, federal finance, yeah, we do offer virtual training sessions. And then the next one is on February 19th and 20th, and we have another one in May 21st and 22nd. So you can, feel free to register. We also have an in-person training that will take place sometime in the fall, October 14 and 15. So if you want to learn more about what can you or can you not do, please sign up.
Well, and one thing we're doing in my team, we're just not as organized and ready as Anthony and his group to have dates and stuff set up, is we're actually really taking it, when you look at the joint policy statement on inclusion that Health and Human Services and Department of Ed re-released a year or so ago, there are key recommendations regarding early childhood finance oversight, and finance mapping. And Meg and I are working with some of our colleagues to really develop some resources and professional development on how to do that, right? Like, I mean, it's great to say you should do a finance mapping plan. It's like, well, okay, how to do that. Especially if you're not part of the state education agency, right? You're part of one of these community programs, a Head Start, a child care program, a private nonprofit, and you want to have inclusive services. But you need to understand who your partners are and what the funding resources would be available from an early childhood perspective. So stay tuned. But we just really, really appreciate, Cindy, you and your team and your group. You can contact us with follow-up questions. Anybody, I always feel bad for anybody who has to go back and listen to a recording of me. But if anyone in your group and in your class or your consortia have questions about any of this content, that because they weren't able to chime in like Rochelle and Laura and Maddie could, just please let us know.
Yeah, I appreciate you all being here and being able to present on this important information. I know finance has been a topic of conversation in all our community teams. So I think just hearing it from another person's perspective, especially from you all that are professionally working in this area, it'll help some of our communities be able to get some questions in their minds and start kind of thinking about what areas, barriers and solutions that they can come up with. But thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Everyone, I hope you feel better, Cindy.
Thank you.
Feel better. Happy New Year. It is only the 8th, although it feels like we've already been into the year quite a long time.